So to dig a little deeper into how extreme weather and patterns are affecting agriculture and consumer prices, Jennifer Turner joins me here. She's the director of the China Environment Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center here in Washington. Always good to have you on, Jennifer.
Love being here.
Now, this series of floods in China has been one of the costliest. So how is all this affecting inflation in terms of the cost to businesses and consumers?
Well, I mean, there are the immediate impacts. I mean, right, you've got buildings toppled in the last typhoon along the coastal areas, something like 50 billion renminbi, 80 billion. I mean, just the numbers keep going up. I mean, there's the immediate cost, but we've seen over the past 10 years, anytime that there are major floods, that food prices go up. I mean, the crops get inundated. The pig farms, the factory farms, a lot of them on the coast of China, you know, China's been consolidating their pig raising. And so right after these big floods, we see a lot of rises in pork production. And in great part, this comes from the fact that, you know, along the coast of China, with not only the pork, but the cities themselves are extremely vulnerable to floods. I mean, you think of like Shanghai, it's about 8 times bigger than New York, lots of cement, not much drainage.
Now, as you mentioned, the short-term effects, what about the longer-term impacts? And should things eventually even out?
Well, I think that, the problem is that we are going to be seeing a lot, the big typhoons that come in, that makes the headlines. But when we're looking at these big cement cities in China, and also a lot of the upstream rivers where the wetlands and the lakes have been filled over the years for flood control, that even somewhat big rainstorms end up causing floods. And so, the cities themselves are impacted, transport, the farms in the area. And so it's kind of an ongoing problem that the government really has to deal with on how to cope with these cities that just can't handle it.
And as you're mentioning the way that these cities cope with things, what are some things then that perhaps Beijing should be working on to perhaps limit the impact when they do have these extreme weather events?
Well, one thing, I mean, I was like saying some good news, some not so good news. On the good news front, like think of Chinese ports. China now has 7 of the 10 world's largest ports are in China, and they've only been built in the last 10 years. So they've been building them, getting ready for heavy storms, for sea level rise. I mean, a lot of the coastal cities, I mean, they're going to be in trouble as the sea level starts rising. A lot of the mangroves along China's coasts have disappeared, but now there's some more efforts in saying, well, we need to kind of protect these and maybe take some of the, they've been building out the land. Hong Kong's notorious, but some cities there are now restrictions on how, can you do land reclamation, that you really shouldn't put yourself in the eye of the storm by building out these cities.
Now, one of the things people worry about is agriculture, which does tend to really bear the brunt of these climate events. So what are some of the key things people should be concerned about? Is it just agriculture, or is it much bigger than that?
Well, I mean, agriculture is the big, we keep going back to pork because pork prices, that's the big indicator of overall economic health. And so when we see the pork prices are going to go up in the next few weeks after all these floods. But it's not just the flooding. I mean, there's also the drought challenges in China. I mean, North China makes headlines, but southwestern China, where a lot of the hydro is, and there's still a fair amount of agriculture, that they've been experiencing growing number of droughts over the past decade, and how China kind of balances that out. One way they do is actually, we're seeing China increasing their food imports, not just in crops, but even in pork issues.
So then with that being said, how do you think this is going to affect GDP then?
Well, I think that I mean, there'll be a problem, in the short term. I think over the long run, as China, they're trying to make investments to kind of deal with these kinds of crises. But at the same time, it just kind of, it's some ways, maybe it's like the new normal for them.
Now, what about in addressing this problem? Are there some perhaps business opportunities when it comes to when they're rebuilding these things, perhaps changing the structure, the infrastructure to better cope with these things? What sort of opportunities are there?
Well, I think a big area of investment in cities, there's a policy, I don't know if you've had stories on it, Sponge City. You heard that term?
We haven't
here's
used
a
it
new
yet
one
so far.
Sponge City is a policy that the problem with stormwater runoff, causing all these floods, that we need to, not only do we need to make more greenery and building more parks, but, rooftop solar, buildings and drainage systems. So there's definitely, it's not horribly sexy sounding, but helping cities kind of cope with the increased rain, typhoons, and also other ways, water saving as well, because we have drought areas. So there's lots of opportunities. And I think that, it's one of some of the priorities in the 13th five-year plan to kind of encourage this kind of investment.
That's definitely something we'll be keeping an eye on. Thank you. We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Jennifer Turner, director of the China Environment Forum at the Woodrow Wilson Center.
Thank you.